I think that's what happened in America. Whites became stigmatized as racist. And from that point on, whites are in the position of forever having to prove the negative, that they're not a racist. Again, if they don't prove the negative, then the stigma sticks. Well, you must be a racist. And so since that time, whites, and particularly, again, our institutions, have lived under threat of stigmatization. Why is that important? It's important because if you are stigmatized as a racist in American society, if an institution, let's say, it's easier, I think, to see on an institutional level, then that institution becomes illegitimate. It loses its legitimacy. It loses its ability to really function in the society. So the stigma has a powerful impact because it has so much control over the legitimacy. How can you be a legitimate institution in a multiracial society that is supposed to be free and everyone is supposed to be equal under the law? How can you be legitimate if you don't have any blacks in your institution? So we could look at a disparity like that. Blacks could, again, moral authority having passed to us, we could look at a disparity like that and we could say, you don't have any blacks in your institution, it's a racist institution, it's illegitimate, we will sue it, we will do whatever it takes. And in a sense, since the 60s, that's pretty much what has happened, is that minorities have begun to sort of manipulate that stigma. And so we call it in some circles today the race card. We play the race card. What does the race card mean? Well, if you don't do what I want you to do, then you're going to be stigmatized as a racist, and the price you'll pay is you'll lose your legitimacy. So white guilt is powerful, is a powerful, powerful force, not because people feel guilty, but because people are stigmatized, and again have to prove the negative all the time, and for living forever under threat of being stigmatized. This leads to the next phenomenon that is a feature of white guilt, and that's dissociation. The only way to get away from the stigma of being a racist is to find some way to dissociate oneself from the stigma, from the image that you are a racist, that you are like the whites of old, that you still secretly are a white supremacist, that you still secretly believe in this, that your heart is, that you may be smiling, but your heart is still committed to racism. And so, again, whites walking around under this sort of cloud of suspicion then have to find ways to dissociate themselves from that. I think the first great example of dissociation in American life was President Johnson's Great Society. Why all of a sudden, in 1965, do you just say, well, we're going to spend billions and billions of dollars, we're going to create all kinds of social programs, and we're going to dump all this money on, and we're going to end poverty in our time. You create all these programs, almost all of which failed. Certainly they did not eradicate poverty. They did not bring about racial equality. They did virtually nothing. But they did dissociate the American society and the American government from the stigma of racism. The federal government had just, by its own legislation, acknowledged that it had been racist. That was too much moral authority for minorities to have. And the government really had to do something dramatic because the sin had been so dramatic. The wrong had been so dramatic and had gone on for so long and had so clearly violated the principles of a free society that America had to do something big and huge, had to spend a lot of money to say, in effect, we're not like that anymore. We're not that old America that discriminated and oppressed people. We're a new America And we're going to even get rid of poverty. We're going to wipe it out from the human condition. So it wasn't that the Great Society was actually going to, the purpose of the Great Society was not actually to end poverty or achieve racial equality. It was to restore some legitimacy to the American government, to the American society. I remember that time very well. I was in college in those years, and as much as I disagree with the Great Society, as terrible as it was, as wasteful as it was, as destructive as it was, I can remember feeling that I was not going to recognize my own government if it didn't do something, if it didn't make some gesture. I'd be happy to tell it what kind at this point, but it didn't. It certainly didn't make the right one, and I was a part of it. Not that back in those days, but it had to do something. President Johnson, there were riots from one end of America to the other. Los Angeles burned up, New York, Newark, Detroit. Huge riots, destructive riots, many deaths, much property damage. And it looked as though blacks were simply no longer going to identify with America as their nation. Militant groups began to spring up everywhere. Cultural nationalists, the Black Panthers, right up the road here in Oakland, with no longer with nonviolent passive resistance, now with guns, and ready to have shootouts with the police and so forth. So the president knew there had to be something used to dissociate the United States government from the past, to say we're not like that anymore. We're a different America. Well, my feeling is that almost all of the racial policy since the Great Society, since 1965, has been designed not to solve racial problems, but to dissociate our institutions and our government from its racist past, and to restore moral authority and legitimacy to the government. You see, for example, a few years ago in the affirmative action case, the Michigan case that was decided, there were 100 briefs were submitted to the Supreme Court in favor of racial preferences by every imaginable American institution, from corporations to city governments, even the military submitted a brief. You notice there was no march on Washington in favor of affirmative action by blacks, by black people or other minorities, nothing. But this extraordinary pressure from America's institutions arguing that the Supreme Court ought to allow racial preferences to stay in place. Well, again, why? I think the reason is because those institutions are saying, look, we are under a stigma. Our legitimacy is at stake here. We have to have a way to prove, to indicate that we're not like that anymore, that we're not an exclusive, racist institution. We are an open, inclusive, that's the new word, inclusive institution that wants everybody in our midst. And so we have to have diversity policies, and we have to be able to bring in minorities so that they're here, because again, our entire legitimacy depends on it. Harvard University, Stanford University, all of the Ivy League have to have about 8% of every single freshman class be black. Has to be. Not 7, not 6, but at least 8. Probably without racial preferences, about 1 to 2% of every freshman class would be black. So the rest, the 7%, are the result of racial preferences. I've written a lot about how the negative effects I think that has on minorities. I think one of the cruelest things a society can do is to take the best and the brightest young black Americans and basically say to them, you simply cannot compete with the best and brightest of other races. We won't allow you to do that. You can't do it. You have to depend on our paternalism. Well, what a cruel thing to do to a group that's trying to overcome 4 centuries of oppression. But does the administration at Harvard or Stanford or Yale or Princeton or any of those schools care about the impact that they're having on black students, the way they're stigmatizing them as second-raters? Even that 1 or 2% who would have gotten into that institution anyway? They say, look, we have to have 8% blacks in our freshman class. We don't care about you because that our whole legitimacy, the legitimacy of our institution depends on that. If we go down to 1 or 2%, then we are going to be stigmatized as a racist university. Faculty won't want to come here. We will lose money. We will lose grants. Our institution will decline in its whole. We will lose our reputation in every way. And so, baby, we're going to have 8% blacks in this freshman class if we got to go and no matter what we have to do to get them. Because it's the dissociation from the stigma that is so necessary to the legitimacy of the institution.